Well, welcome to a slightly different episode of Specimen Series. As it's Christmas, we thought we'd do something completely different. And believe it or not, we've been filming the series for over 7 years now. And in those 7 years, we've captured some really special moments on camera. So this episode is all going to be about some of my favourite moments of Specimen Series and some of those great captures that we've got on camera. Well, as it is Christmas, and it's very wintry outside, let's start with a winter episode of Specimen Series that saw me targeting chub, and it all started off on my local River Wensum. Now in hindsight, I got it completely wrong that first day. I knew the river would be very high, but I didn't expect it to be quite as high as it was that morning when we arrived. It was in full flood, and when I marched the poor cameraman Chris up and down that river that day, desperately trying to get a bite in probably what were terrible conditions. But despite the conditions, I didn't give up. We kept leapfrogging along the river. Then I finally managed to get a bite in the afternoon, but sadly it was a very small chub, maybe about £3. And while that first day on the Wensum really did get me thinking, if I need to catch a big chub on camera, quite simply I need to fish a river that contains big chub. And my local Wensum now, there are 1 or 2 nice fish, but it has faced problems with predation from otters and cormorants and various things. So I think plan B for this episode was to jump in the van, go further afield and see if we could find some big fish. So after doing a little bit of homework about what venues might be an option for this episode, everything was pointing to the River Ouse. Now I've never fished the Ouse for chub before, and I had a little bit of help from a couple of good friends. I had my friend Adam, who lives down near the river, and we also spoke to the staff in Angling Direct in Milton Keynes. And we chose a couple of stretchers to try our luck, but it was a little bit Operation Blind Stab. Having never been there before, I really was starting from scratch. And that first day, there was a bit of a common theme to this. When we got to the river again, the Ouse was very, very high, almost in full flood again. And it was very much like that first day. We were struggling to get a bite up and down the flooded river. And I think I managed 2, maybe 3 fish that first day. But again, nothing over £3. We'd travelled all that way, put in all that extra effort, thinking we might get a big chub. And we just got 2 or 3 bites and 2 or 3 small chubs. So 2 days in, which was a bit of a luxury for a Specimen Series, and all I'd had was a handful of bites and a handful of very average chub to show. But we did have 1 more day's filming on the Ouse the next day. And well, that evening, myself and Chris out for a meal and a couple of drinks, had a bit of a discussion about where we should go the next day. And my friend Adam had mentioned a stretch that he said was very difficult, but the chance of a really big fish. And well, let's face it, we'd been struggling to get bites anyhow, and when we had those bites, they were not the size fish that we really wanted. So if we're going to struggle, we might as well struggle on a stretch where we might catch something special. So that next morning, we planned to try yet a different stretch of the River Ouse, and we had that mentality of go big or go home. Well, we had a proper chub fisherman's morning that last day. There was a sharp frost as we walked across the fields towards the river, and I must admit the river looked much nicer. Being a much wider section of the river, it coped with that extra water a lot better, and the water had dropped overnight as well, so it was looking a lot more promising. And I had a feeling that we might get the fish we want this last day. I'm always super confident in all my fishing. I think that's quite important to have a sort of positive attitude. Yet despite my positive attitude, I fished my socks off that morning, trying lots of different swims. And I'm sure I had a couple of inquiries, but not really enough to strike at. And it was quite quickly lunchtime, and I hadn't had a positive bite all morning. And I was thinking, you know, we'd put quite a bit of time into this episode. It wasn't looking great, and we just needed that 1 bite from 1 special fish. And I'd almost given up hope. In fact, I was actually on the phone to one of my friends at the time when the rod tip, well, it was more of a barbel type bite than a chub bite. It nearly pulled the rod off the rest, and I was clearly hooked into a chub, much, much bigger than anything I'd hooked so far. I was an absolute nervous wreck playing this fish. My life depended on landing the chub, and I ran down the river as it was pulling my arm off. And then when I did see how big it was, I was slightly panicky because in my haste to get nearer to the chub and keep it out of the trees, I'd left my lander net upriver. So suddenly Chris, the cameraman, had to sacrifice a little bit of his filming skills to quickly throw the lander net down to me. But everything was fine. I managed to get the chub in the net. And if I'm honest, it'd been a while since I'd seen a big chub. And when that sat resting in the net, I honestly thought it was going to be absolutely enormous. But I wasn't disappointed when we lifted it up on the bank. I was hoping for a chub over £5, and landing in the bottom of my net was a £6 7-ounce chub. So that shows you how fishing can be, from a real desperate, difficult situation to getting one bite, and then suddenly you've got the fish of your dreams that's sitting in your landing net. I don't think I've ever been so pleased to see the quiver tip pull round. It's been really hard fishing this morning. I think I might have missed a bite. I didn't miss this bite, and he pulled my arm off in this fast flow. The river's still fairly high, so that's mega. Just under £6.5 at £6.7. That'll be my third ever chub off the ooze. I caught my first two yesterday that were both very small, but how about that one? I'm over the moon with that one. And to think there's chub bigger than that in this river is mad. In my world, that's a big chub. Well, what is it they say about you wait ages for a bus and then two come at once? We hadn't long slipped that chub back, and I moved about 50 yards further down the river along a line of trees that looked really good, cast out a lump of cheese paste. Well, it must have been 30 seconds, a minute, and I received another real positive bite, and I was connected to yet another big chub. So 2 days with just small chub, and then 2 casts, 2 bites, and I'm hooked into my second £6 chub of the trip. And again, when we got that one in the net, I was a lot calmer playing this one. I think there was a big weight off my shoulders, and I could see it was definitely over £6. The scales confirmed it's £6.5, and we'd got the second £6 chub of the afternoon. Probably about £6.5, I'd say. Brace of sixes. Looking fairly disastrous to 2 very small chub yesterday to a brace of sixes today, so pays not to give up and keep trying. He's a lovely chub he is. Thank you, buddy. Well, after catching those 2 chub, the pressure was off, my confidence was much higher, and we leapfrogged along the river, making our way back to where we'd left the car, hoping for just one more fish, but I couldn't get another bite. Everywhere that looked chubby, I'd fish. But in the back of my mind, the very first swim that I'd fished when we'd got there that morning, a little overhanging tree not far from the car park, I definitely had a little rattle and a little inquiry in that swim. I thought it might have been crayfish in the morning, but looking back, I thought I'd better drop back in that swim and be a little bit more alert and be prepared to strike the smallest of bites if they happened. And well, I dropped back in that bush, put out the cheese paste again, hovered my hand above the rod, and had a couple of tiny little taps, and then it just pulled around that little bit more, and I thought, well, there's nothing to lose, I might as well have a strike at it. And well, believe it or not, another £6 chub. I think this one was just slightly over £6, and my third £6-pounder of the trip. Whoa. Come on, don't you go under the bank. Another nice one. We're going to bumble him straight in. Brilliant. I think the secret to catching big chub is fishing where big chub live. That's definitely what I've learned today. Really pleased with that. Another really nice looking river ooze chub. Well, I think the reason I like that episode so much is it shows how much determination can pay off. And with specialist fishing, just one bite, or in this case 3 bites, can turn a fairly disastrous trip into one of your best trips. So never give up, stay positive, because you can be one step away from a really big fish. So now on to the next episode. We're going to skip forward to the summertime, travelling over to the west side of the country to my good friend Ed Matthews Lake over in Shropshire, where I'm targeting some very special fish, something I don't get to fish for very often, some really big crucian carp. On arrival at Ed's Lake, the first thing that I did was have a walk around. I have fished the lake before, but a long while ago, so I thought I'd better have a quick recce trip, a wander around and see where I fancied fishing for the crucians. And one thing I do know about crucians is they like a bit of cover, and the corner of the lake that the wind was blowing into quite gently had this big canopy of overhanging willow trees, and it looked perfect for a big crucian. I know it would be quite tight to set up in that swim, and there'd probably be much more comfortable swims for fishing and filming, but I really wanted to try and catch some of these special crucians, and it just ticked all the right boxes. So that was where I set up for that first day. And because of the overhanging trees, it was really difficult to cast, so I had a secret weapon in the van in the shape of a baiting spoon. Now this might be a really untraditional way of fishing for crucians, but it would be a real edge. I decided to use little flatbed method feeders and gently place them under the canopy of the willow tree perfectly every time, fishing really neatly and really quietly and as efficiently as I can. So it's a bit of a learning curve using method feeders for crucians for the first time, but it's not the first time I've used method feeders. They're really effective for tench fishing, so I was sure they'd work for these big crucians. And I wasn't long in being proved right. I hadn't had them out in the water very long at all, and I had a lovely big crucian quite quickly. I think it was £2.11 from memory, and in my world of crucian fishing, that wasn't far off my PB, and it looked absolutely enormous.
Well, I don't think I've ever been more happy to catch a fish. That's one of my favourite fish, and that looks like a nice one as well. So, who doesn't love a big crucian carp, eh? Well, I can't put into words how happy I am with that. I feel these big crucian carp, it's almost a privilege to hold them because they're such rare fish nowadays. They tend to get bullied out by the king carp in venues. So to find a water that's not only got true crucians, but ones that look like this is great. And I'm absolutely chuffed to bits, but can't really want to get that rod back out because, believe it or not, this is probably about an average size for this lake. This one's £2.11, and they certainly go a pound bigger than that in here. How about that? Off you go, buddy. I hadn't long slipped that first crucian back and put the feeder back out with a baiting spoon on the same spot, and I was soon playing my second crucian. And as this one slid into the net, I could see it was slightly bigger still. Now, I've never caught a £3 crucian before, but I had then. I'd got a £3.1 crucian. It was a new PB for me, and it's my first personal best ever to catch for the Specimen Series cameras. So over the moon with that. I couldn't have wished for a better start. And strangely enough, after I'd caught that £3-pounder, I had a phone call from Ed Matthews that runs the lake, and he seemed quite surprised in my choice of swims. It was a very overgrown, neglected corner of the lake that most of his members don't fish. So had I had that phone call with Ed before I set up, it might have changed my mind about setting up in that swim, which would have been a mistake because it turned out under that willow tree was an absolute dynamite spot for those big crucians. Well, it didn't stop there. The crucian activity continued in the swim, fizzing and rolling fish, and I kept getting bites, and I upped my PB yet again, catching a £3.5 crucian that looked absolutely enormous. I'd never seen a £3 crucian on the bank until that morning, and I think I'd had 3 by then, like I said, with a new PB of £3.5. And just for a little bit of fun in between the crucians, I did have a mirror carp gate crash the party, which was great fun trying to play it in that tight little swim. I think it was about £24–25, but on a 1¼ pound test curve rod, that certainly did run me a merry dance. I went into the evening a very happy angler, and I could still see fish moving in the swim. And I think I had another one that was probably about £2–2.5 pounds, but being as I was on such a high, I didn't weigh it because I didn't think it was as big as the other ones. And I decided rather than fish through the night, which can be quite difficult filming, I'd reel the rods in at night. Then we'd have a fresh start early in the morning and see if we could catch 1 or 2 more before we had to drive back to our homes in Norfolk. Well, I hardly slept that night because I was super excited to get the rods out the next morning. And if I'm honest, I got them out quite early in the morning. It was still dark when I put the feeders back out. I hadn't disturbed Chris. He was getting some much needed rest. And I had a bite quite quickly, but not the crucian I'd hoped for, but a close second prize. I had an even bigger carp, and quite a rare carp for me. It was a true leather carp at over £30 on the crucian gear, so that was a very welcome gate crasher. But then it wasn't long before I had another crucian, and believe it or not, it was an even bigger one. From memory, I believe it was £3.12, another PB crucian, and it put the end to what was probably the best crucian fishing I've experienced. So I think 3–4 times I broke my PB, never caught a £3 crucian, and I'd suddenly caught a handful of them. I can't believe I'm holding a £3.12 crucian. It's not a big crucian, it's an enormous crucian carp. So the next episode on my list has to be a trip down the river test. I got invited to fish a stretch of the river run by Ollie Johnson, who does guided days on the river. And after speaking to him on the phone, I didn't really know what to expect. He spoke about giant dace, big grayling, even £2 roach off the river. So rather than plant a fish for any particular species, I thought we'd head down there with the trotting gear, enjoy 2 days trotting on the river and just see what turns up. On arrival at the river test, it didn't disappoint. It looked absolutely beautiful and I couldn't wait to start fishing. But I had a quick guided tour from Ollie. We started off at a beautiful weir pool at the top, and as you follow the river down, it kind of meanders round an island, causing some lovely creases, and there looked so many nice swims to trot a float through. So that was the plan, to start exploring the river, trotting maggots with some nice big heavy floats to see what we would catch. Well, I started getting bites almost straight away, and most of the fish I were getting were some lovely dace. 1 or 2 of those dace were probably some of the biggest dace I've ever caught. And amongst those dace was a few heart-stopping moments when you hook a trout. And when you first hook some of those big brown trout in that fast flow, they feel like a big chunky roach. And in the back of my mind, I know it was a bit of a tall order wishing for a £2 river roach, but I was assured there were fish that had been caught off that stretch over £2, and it seemed to be fishing well. And every time that float went under, every time I strike, I kept thinking, please be a big roach. Several days later, several trout later, I hooked into a fish that I thought this could be it. This might be the roach I'd hoped for. And then, believe it or not, you have guessed it, as it came towards the net, the most beautiful big river roach I'd ever seen, definitely over £2, was sitting in the bottom of my landing net. Well, I've caught lots of £2 roach on camera from still waters, but that's the first £2 I've managed to catch from a river for the Specimen Series camera. So it was a bit of a special moment for me. And to make it even more special, I hadn't long had that fish, and I had a very similar roach a few trots later. This one was slightly under £2, but it wasn't far behind, and I had a nice big chunky roach in each hand, ready for the cameras. Well, how about that for a brace of river roach? The top one's £2 too, and that bottom one is 1.14, so that's more than I could have asked for trotting down here on the river test. But I'm going to slip these fellas back. It's getting really windy now because I've got 2 mega dace sitting in that keep net that I'm itching to know how big they are. The bites continued all afternoon, and as if I wasn't lucky enough to catch those 2 big roach, the dace fishing just got better and better and better. And I had a couple of dace there. I can't remember the exact weights, but both of them were very close to £1. Now that might not sound huge to a lot of anglers that don't do specimen fishing, but some fish around that 14-15 ounce mark are really big dace. So £2 roach, some really big dace, and I still had the second day to look forward to. There's my second prize of the morning, as well as those big roach, 2 clonking great big dace. The top one we've weighed at about 13.5 ounces, and the bottom one I believe was 12 ounces. But dace always look so much bigger than they weigh. But again, for the second time this morning, I'm over the moon with these fish. River fishing doesn't get much better than this at the end of the season. We returned to that same stretch of river the following morning, and I tried a few different areas, catching some smaller roach, a few more dace, and even the odd big brown trout. And as much as I wanted to go back in that swim where I'd caught those big roach, I think for the benefit of the episode, rather than watching me just fishing the same swim for another day, Ollie suggested another beat a bit further down the river that might give us an option of 1 or 2 big graylings. So we'd caught big roach, we'd caught some massive dace. Wouldn't it be nice to finish it off with a £2 plus grayling? The second stretch of river that we visited was quite a bit different to the first stretch. The first stretch was almost an urban location. There was quite a few houses and the big mill house itself. But this second stretch was much more rural. It was in some rolling fields, a really windy bit of the river test, a few carrier streams joining onto it, and it looked like a river angler's paradise. So we started exploring that river. There was definitely less fish there, and I started off getting a few bites, but mostly trout. Then I think it must have been the 3rd or the 4th fish that I was sure was another trout when I was playing it. Turned out to be a nice chunky grayling, maybe around £1.5 pounds, but a nice dark fish. And I thought, this looks promising. If they're going up to £1.5 pounds on that stretch, I'm sure there'd be some slightly bigger ones. I was playing this one quite heavy-handedly, thinking it was another trout, and there's a nice big grayling on the end, so hopefully I can get it in. Not the most graceful of netting for the cameraman, but there we go.
Well, I'm glad we made that decision to have a move. This is an absolutely beautiful stretch of river, and although I started off catching a few trout, constant feeding and just keep getting bites, and well, I'm over the moon with this. This is a really nice grayling. It's a bit of a treat for me to catch grayling. I don't go grayling fishing that often living in Norfolk, and well, I think this one's comfortably over 1.5 pounds. It's a nice big fish for me, and I think we better slip it back and see if there's any more of these amongst those trout. Now at this point, time was ticking past quite quickly. We had a long drive home, so we didn't want to be there all day, and I didn't want to stop fishing, to be honest. I'm well known for my one more casts, and there were so many nice looking swims, and it was impossible to fish them all. But after leapfrogging down the river, catching a few more average sized grayling, there was one swim that both me and Chris looked at, and we thought it looked like the best swim so far. And it was my second or maybe third trot through the swim, and I was suddenly connected to a much bigger grayling. Now anyone who's fished for grayling in that fast flow on those chalk streams knows how hard they fight. And while this grayling was pretending to be a trout, even leaping out of the water a couple of times when I was playing it. I think it was on a tiny size 18 hook, so I was quite nervous playing this fish. But I needn't have worried. I had it sitting in the bottom of the net. We had ourselves a perfect end to 2 days on the river test in the shape of a 2-pound grayling. Well, if that was my hook hold, I needed to be worried. That is in there by a slither. Well, how about that for a fish to end on at £2.2? That's an amazing grayling. So we've had roach over £2. We've had what I could best describe as double figure dace. And now to end on this is absolutely brilliant. So I can't thank Ollie enough. If you're interested in fishing this river, look up Ollie Johnson. He's been absolutely brilliant the last couple of days. And if you want to find a bit more information, he is on the Go Catch app as well for his guided trips. So, well, I'm going to slip this back. It's best to get these grayling back fairly quickly. And if you like this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to our channel to see the next ones. Right, the next episode to make the list. And the reason I've chosen this episode is another example of determination paying off in the end. So it started with a real struggle, and I was over at Barbara Lakes in Norfolk trying to catch some tench in the springtime, but very early spring. We still had overnight frosts. It was a little bit early to be targeting tench. I tried my best, and I had a false sense of security. We hadn't been fishing long. We put the rods out, and I actually caught a fish before I even got the bobbin on the line. So I got off to a promising start, but little did I know how tough that session would be at the beginning. We're in. Well, if I manage to land this one, that'll be my first tench this year. This is my first trip, and what a lovely morning to make your first trip. It's been absolutely beautiful this morning. Now, catching that tench so early on led me into a bit of a false sense of security. I thought it was going to be a start of something. I thought the tench were then waking up, but how wrong was I? I absolutely fished my socks off that day. I kept recasting the feeders. I kept trickling a little bit of bait over the spots with a spom, but I just couldn't buy another bite. And as the afternoon wore on into the evening, it seemed really quiet, and I thought I'd got my timing wrong again. After all, it was April, it was really cold. I think they were north or northeasterly winds, and as we went into the night, we had another sharp frost, and I thought this is mission impossible. But that next morning was an absolutely beautiful morning, and Chris did the episode justice. He got some brilliant footage of the mist rising up over the lake, and despite that sharp frost, I received a bite quite early on and caught my second tench of the trip, which turned out to be a little bit of a turning point. Now, similar to the episode with the chub, the reason I like this episode is it shows when you're quite close to defeat, you think it's not going to happen, but you persevere, you keep fishing, you keep as confident as you can. And well, that first bite that morning soon led to another bite. There was even a moment when I had a triple take where I had 3 tench all in the net together, where all 3 rods consecutively received bites. So the fishing went from a really difficult start to an absolutely fantastic session. I don't know how many tench I caught that day, but it was a really enjoyable tench fishing at a mega venue, and it just proves that you just need to keep pressing on, think confident, keep fishing, because it can switch on at any moment. So you may notice a bit of a common theme to my favourite episodes, and it probably reflects my own personal fishing as well. I quite like a struggle. When the odds are stacked against you and it eventually comes good, I think that buzz is even higher. So this leads me on to another struggle, and the most recent episode that we've filmed, you find me over on the River Trent trying to catch myself a nice big barbel. Now, although we've filmed on the Trent for barbel a few times on the Specimen Series, and they've been really successful trips catching numbers of barbel, those bigger barbel had eluded me. I mean, I'd had low doubles before on camera, but what would have been really nice was to catch something that next step, something that little bit bigger. Now, you might not think that's too difficult on the Trent, but we have quite a limited time scale. These are normally done in an overnight trip. At a very push, we might get 2 days on the river, but we're not there. We don't have much time to catch the fish, so we have to try and make it happen fairly quickly. So on that basis, I'd done a bit of homework, and I got invited to fish the fantastic Gunthorpe Weir on the non-tidal Trent. He had a real good track record for some big fish, so that's where we decided to do this episode. On arrival at the Trent, I must admit I was slightly surprised. I knew the water levels would be high, but I wasn't expecting it to be quite as high as it was. It was an absolute boiling torrent of water coming through the weir pool, chocolate brown in colour. And we did speak to a chap who was fishing just down from the weir, who told us he couldn't hold bottom with 10 ounces of lead, and he'd had 1 bite in 3 days. So my confidence was knocked slightly, and I thought I only had 5-ounce leads in my rucksack. Would I even be able to hold bottom to fish effectively? So the first job when I got to the swim, just on the bottom of the weir pool, was just to put a 5-ounce lead on, have a bit of a feel around the swim. Again, I hadn't fished the venue before, and just see if I could actually hold bottom to present a bait in case those barbel wanted to feed. I found a really nice spot. If you looked at the bottom of the weir pool, there's a floating pontoon that you can actually walk out on. The water flows underneath that pontoon, causing some really nice barbely looking creases. So I lowered one of those 5-ounce leads down, and it held perfectly. And I thought, well, at least I'm fishing. And to my surprise, I put 2 rods out, stood there admiring the rod tips, thinking, am I actually going to catch anything on this trip? And I received a bite almost instantly. And it felt like a much bigger barbel than it was in that strong flood water. And I had a small barbel, maybe 3 or 4 pound at best, but I had a bite, and it was another one of those confidence lifting moments. I carried on fishing in that flood water on that first day, and I just couldn't get another bite. I think I was just really lucky to find barbels sitting in that slack water, but I think the flood water probably pushed them down from the weir into some slightly calmer water away from that raging torrent. And although I fished really hard and I fished through the night, I just couldn't get another bite. And I kind of went home with my tail between my legs. But I managed to plead the powers that be at Angling Direct to let us go back and have another go a couple of weeks later when that floodwater subsided in some much more friendly conditions. Fast forward to 2 weeks later when we returned back to Gunthorpe, and the river looked much nicer. I bet it had dropped well over a metre, and the colour had dropped just nicely. There was still a little bit of clarity, but it looked much more fishy. And similar to that first trip, I got the rods out and really quickly I received a bite, albeit a chub, but I thought this is much better. And I could fish quite a few different areas in the weir pool this time. That first trip, because of all that flow, there was only really one spot I could lower those rigs, and that was just off the main flow. But now the flow had slowed down in pace, I could explore the weir pool more, try a few different spots, and I had more options to try and get a bite. And I kept fishing through that first day. Another chub turned up, 2 chub, no barbel, but in the back of my mind I was still super confident. I had the best time to look forward to, the evening into dark, and I just felt that it was going to happen on this trip. Now, I probably lost my head a little bit on this trip because everyone who popped to say hello to me fishing on the weir pool, they all had advice where you should cast. You know, people always catch one there, you always get a bite there. And I started exploring quite a bit, just casting single PVA bags all around the weir pool, trying to get another bite. But in the back of my mind, I thought I need to just keep plugging away at those same spots on that crease where I'd caught those 2 chub, get the bait dropper out, keep baiting and waiting and baiting, and those barbel would come on the feed at some point. So I returned back to the usual spot where I'd been fishing from the beginning, kept the bait trickling in, kept recasting the rods, and I hadn't had a barbel as the light was fading, but as I've said earlier, I felt it was going to happen. Confidence is a big thing in this style of fishing,
And then my confidence was reassured. It must have been around midnight. I received an absolute screaming barbel bite, grabbed the rod off the tripod, steadily made my way down onto that floating pontoon, and I was finally connected to not only a barbel, but the barbel that I was really hoping for. In that strong flow, it felt absolutely enormous, and as I saw it in the head torch, I thought, this is the one. This is the biggest barbel we've caught on Specimen Series so far, and I wasn't disappointed when a barbel weighing 14 pounds and 4 ounces went safely in my landing net. Well, I am slightly lost for words. It's been a real tough trip. Coming here a few weeks ago when the river was in full flood and barely being able to fish, then coming back and it looking so good on this trip, yet just having those 2 chub. Well, how about this? 14 pound 4 of River Trent barbel. It's been a while since I've had one this big. It's an absolutely stunning fish. I'm over the moon and well worth being woken up for and having to jump out of the sleeping bag. Now that one barbel alone would have made the trip for me. I didn't get any more through the hours of darkness. The following morning, I decided to put a few more bait droppers out, recast the rods, and see if I could catch just one more before we had to leave. And it happened quite quickly. The first bite of that morning wasn't the usual barbel bite, it was a very subtle bite. I thought it might have been another chub, but I think what happened is the barbel had picked up my bait. Instead of running down the river, it was just moving across the flow with it. And I had another hard fighting barbel, my second barbel of that second trip, and it was another double at over 12 pounds. Yes, now. Oh my God. He's another 12 pluser, isn't he? Well, how about that for a perfect looking barbel? Just over 12 pound this one. And well, if that isn't an example of how bait in the swim can trigger the barbel into feeding, I'd had nothing since that 14 pounder in the early hours. Woke up this morning, got the bait dropper out, refreshed the rods. Within 25-30 minutes, this lovely fish came along. It's been a long while since I've seen big barbel like this. We used to have a few in the Wensum, but they've sadly all gone. So I have to come to the Trent to try and find some of these. Now you could tell that the river was in much better condition. I'd had that 14 pound barbel, I'd had a 12 pound barbel, and in between the barbel I was catching 1 or 2 nice chub, including a nice fish over 5 pound that was more than welcome, although I was barbel fishing. And then later that morning I managed to catch my 3rd barbel of the trip and another fish into double figures. So it goes to show, sometimes if you don't get conditions right, don't stress about it, you're not doing anything wrong. We managed to get back in the river when the river was much more friendly. Fished pretty much the same approach, even fished the same spots, and it all comes good in the end. So that's why I like that episode so much. It's not always your fault if the conditions are terrible. If you get your timing right, it can make a big difference. So there you go, that's just a few of my favourite moments from the Specimen series. And I just want to say thank you to all the people that click the like button, all those kind comments that you leave. And what might be nice, if you've got a personal favourite moment from the series, drop it in the comments. It'd be really great to know. And lastly, I just want to say Merry Christmas to everybody and a Happy New Year, and I'll see you in 2025.